Well, thank you guys for joining us today for our HR committee meeting. And thank you to our Chairman Jack for helping us out as always and leading the discussion today. I know we've got a great program for you focused on reopening, but before we go to that, I wanted to spend a minute and give you an update from kind of inside the chamber and share with you some numbers that we're pretty excited about. When this pandemic started, our focus was really to be a clearinghouse resource for our members and for the state to continue to advocate both with the governor and at the federal level on different policies, and then to also start thinking about the recovery part of it. And so that's exactly what we've done now for the last 2.5 months. And in the last 2 weeks, we've really shifted our attention to that, launching our Resiliency and Recovery Task Force, which I want to come back and talk about for a moment. But I do want to share with you the impact that we've had in just by the numbers for the last, since April 1st. Hopefully these numbers make you proud to be a Georgia Chamber member, and I think it tells you how hard our staff have been working on your behalf. So from an engagement standpoint, we've had 3 White House calls. We've endorsed 30 candidates for office. We've produced almost 50 guidance documents based upon the governor's executive orders or federal PPP or whatever the policies are coming out of DC. We've touched 153 times our federal delegation with specific conversations. 213 times we've talked to state legislators or the executive branch. We've participated or hosted 311 conference or video calls. We now have almost 40,000 members of our SMART plan, and we've connected with those companies 4,000 times, almost 5,000 times. Thank you, Mary Claire. We have had direct contact with our members 5,000 times. We've had 9,000 direct contacts with local and state chambers and the U.S. Chamber. The video town halls that we host, and we've done 2 a week now since this thing started. We've had 16,837 participants on those video calls. We've had 2 of those rebroadcast on Georgia Public Broadcast. We've had a 123% increase in LinkedIn. We average just under 600 direct hits to our website, our landing page for COVID exclusively. We've had 600 contacts with the media, 10,000 additional LinkedIn followers, 116,000 Facebook impressions, 126,000 Twitter impressions, and I think the most impressive number is if you add up the articles that we've published or been quoted in, the interviews that we've done on CNN and all over the world, we can track 242,502,000 direct media impressions over the last 6 weeks. So that's 242 million direct media impressions from our just the plethora of outreach that we've been doing. So we've been working around the clock for you, and we appreciate your support through this. As I said, our focus now is on resiliency and our recovery task force, which is being co-chaired by Sonny Dariso, Ben Tarbutton, Teresa White, and our governmental affairs special committee on this is being chaired by Mark Middleton. We've had our first meeting about 2 weeks ago. We've asked all of the committees of the chamber, including we've asked Jack and this committee to send us thoughts, recommendations. What we're looking for are really threefold: recommendations and policy suggestions for state, federal, local. And then we're also looking at what's needed in the upcoming session that'll happen in June. So June 9th is our expected date for a mini session. So we want to be ready to go with issues like liability protection, and then focus on the longer term when we come back in 2021. We've also just issued a letter to the federal delegation outlining, I believe, 10 areas that we think deserve federal attention. And so this task force and your recommendations will feed up into that, as well as strategies and best practices for our members. And so we're going to be focused on that recession recovery, and then also how do we make Georgia businesses more resilient. We're focused on rural resiliency, corporate resiliency, small business survival, retraining, I'm missing one more in there, but but looking for those recommendations there. And so Jack's got that information, part of that task force, that effort. Also, as part of this recovery and resiliency effort, we're launching a webinar series and a roundtable series. The first roundtable will be next week with members of the film and entertainment industry. And basically, we're going to host one of these a week for different industry leaders to come in and talk about how their companies and their industries are adapting, becoming more resilient, and surviving. So you can get best practices from all the different industry sectors. And we'll do one of those every Wednesday all through the summer. And then we'll continue to have our town hall meetings. We had one today with EPA and CDC. We have one Thursday morning at 10:30 with Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, and one next Tuesday with Speaker David Ralston. And so we encourage you to continue to engage and participate in those resources that we're putting out there. But again, I just want to emphasize, any issues, ideas, whether it's a guidance document you think is important, it's a best practice, it's a change in state or federal policy, or it's a change in DOL policy, we need you to send those to us, because we're trying to be the clearinghouse for organizations around Georgia, facilitating that those policy recommendations and strategies back to the different agencies as well as to the governor's office. So thank you for your what you do for the chamber, what you do for your own businesses. Know that we're here 24/7 as a resource for you. Mary Claire is going to continue to run point here, and with the help of Tasha Allen, our HR director too, is going to be helping out on this particular committee as we move forward, because we know how important it's going to be as we move into a world where, as I've said in the media frequently lately, I don't care what your company does, every American business is now in the health and wellness business. And how you take care of your employees, your customers, your clients, all goes back to human resources and what your plans are. So we want to be a resource for you. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I'll stop unless you've got any questions or anybody's got a question for me, because I know you've got a great program today.
Thank you, Chris. Always a big help, the Chamber. You're a great resource. I know you and Mary Claire and everybody else at the Chamber are working very hard to stay on top of things and continue to provide resources to all the members of the Chamber, and we thank you for everything you do. We do have a good program today. Thank you for those who are joining live and those who will be watching the recorded version. We have Evan Gibbs and Emily Shifter here with us today. They're both from Troutman Sanders in labor and employment law. So Emily is a labor and employment associate attorney at Troutman, and Evan is a litigator with Troutman on the employment law. So I'm going to turn it over to them, talk about how we're going to reopen in 2020. If you have any questions, please send them in via chat or via email to Mary Claire, and we'll address all those at the end. But outside of that, I'll turn it over to Emily and Evan.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jack, Chris, Mary Claire. We appreciate the introduction, and thanks for having us, for facilitating this call today. So, we're going to talk about a lot of different stuff today, but, I was getting ready for this. I was thinking about different issues to cover, and I was thinking back, and I remember back to March 8th. I remember I got a call from a client in New York City, and the question was, there had only been a handful of cases, a few in the around 10 or so in New York at the time, and an employee called in and didn't want to come to work because she had to commute on the subway, and it was very crowded coming in from New Jersey to Manhattan, and she felt like she had some pre-existing lung conditions and was nervous about commuting on the subway. And at the time, when I was talking to the client, the recommendations from the CDC and from really all levels of government were really that, hey, we don't really know whether this is going to be very bad. We don't really know if it's really worse than the flu. We don't really know a lot of things, and we certainly didn't know how bad things were going to get and how quickly things were going to change. And I remember us kind of walking through that, and we were a little incredulous of this employee. We thought it was a little bit of an overreaction, and now looking back, I was just thinking about that yesterday. I had to go back and look and see the first time I dealt with this stuff, And that was the very first day. It was March 8th. And it's just crazy how quickly things have changed for everybody. And especially, I think, at least in the work perspective, for us labor and employment lawyers, we've been bombarded with a lot of questions and a lot of new issues. Obviously, we have some new legislation out there, several pieces of new legislation. With respect to the new legislation, today we're not really going to focus. We're not going to try to get too much into the weeds on the new legislation that we have out there. We're going to talk about it at sort of a high level. We're not really going to get too deep into that stuff. We're really focused more during this call on sort of high level logistical issues. We're going to really talk about the things that you can do and should be thinking about sort of on the ground as you're planning, your reopening. So there's a lot of issues. Obviously, there's so many issues, not just legal issues to think about, but again, just sort of logistical issues about how do you do this? What are the best practices? Fortunately, Emily and I, we work with clients not just in Georgia, but really all across the U.S. Some may be headquartered here with operations, in other states, and maybe headquartered elsewhere and have operations here. But we've been lucky in that we've had the opportunity to advise clients under a lot of different state laws. And so we've been able to see kind of what the trends are and what those different issues are for multi-state employers, as well as for folks that are just operating here in Georgia. So with that being said, we're going to focus, some of the things that we'll talk about today. Obviously, this is, a Georgia Chamber presentation. So the Georgia-centric or Georgia-specific issues that come up, we're definitely going to address those. But most of the stuff that we're going to talk about today is really applicable to anybody, no matter where you operate in the U.S. And we'll point out when we're talking about something that's Georgia-specific, we'll be specific and make sure that we're talking about something that really just sort of applies here. So with that being said, I know Emily wanted to mention up front about the importance of having a plan. Sort of mention that, but Emily, what do you want to tell the attendees about the importance of a plan around reopening?
Well, thanks, Evan, and thanks to everyone here at the Chamber for inviting us today. But when we were putting this together, one of the big themes that we've kind of been focusing on for clients is that we would really recommend that you consider having a reopening plan. Obviously today we can't cover everything that you might need in that plan. Every workplace and every workforce, of course, is going to be very different. But we do think that no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, it's important to be deliberate and to think through all of the different aspects that are involved with reopening, whether that's dealing with practical issues with your workplace, how you're going to address the various leave laws and things that we'll address, and to write that out if you can and to record it. And that just helps you to stay deliberate, to be able to demonstrate sort of what you knew and when and why you took certain actions, and really can be sort of your guiding path. So we can't tell you everything to put in that plan today, but we would urge you to sort of take note of some of the areas that we're covering as things to think about as you're planning your plan and issues to consider as you're sort of getting that document together.
Yeah, and that, it sort of harkens back, if you go to many, seminars or programs where attorneys are speaking on HR and employment law issues, we're always talking about documentation. Make sure your documentation is good. Make sure you're tracking what you're doing. And this is really an extension of that. This really should be treated no differently. And I know that, a lot of folks are anxious to get back to work, and there's, we just caution against any sort of knee-jerk reactions of just, okay, well, the mandatory shelter-in-place orders are lifted, so everybody, automatically come back. We just want to kind of walk through all the issues. And with that in mind, this is a roadmap of the things we're going to talk about. We've broken this down into 4 sections, as you can see. The first, again, is sort of the boots on the ground stuff. We're going to go through the logistics. And a lot of this comes from, our discussions with clients. Obviously we're not going to reveal, who's doing what, but we'll kind of walk through the trends that we've seen and the ways that we've worked with clients to plan for returning folks. The second section, we're really focused on some of the legal issues that we really see that have been cropping up throughout this process. Starting mid-March through present, and along with the ones that that you're going to have to deal with as the employees start coming back to work. Then we'll talk about health and safety issues. That's going to be, that's some pretty important stuff. Obviously, like Chris said in the introduction, everybody's sort of in the health and safety business at this point, no matter what industry or what your business actually does. You're at least partially in the business of health and safety at this point. And then the last section, we're just going to talk about, where we see the trends for the lawsuits. I mean, we do anticipate there's going to be quite a bit of new litigation that's going to come out, in the near term from a lot of different things. And so we're going to talk through that so you can be mindful of that when you're putting together and actually rolling out your reopening plan. So we're going to dive right in, and I won't spend too much time here. I mean, I think this is the stuff that everybody knows about. So again, we're talking about sort of Georgia-specific requirements. Currently, when I say currently, I mean as of within the last 30 minutes, I just saw an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that Governor Kemp is actually going to extend some of the restrictions around bars, nightclubs, restaurants. Some of those things he's planning to extend those today. So as of yesterday and this morning, we were finalizing our presentation. They had not been extended. So currently, this says May 13th. They're actually set to expire technically tonight at 11:59 p.m. So a lot of those restrictions, you can go to the Georgia Department of Economic Development. That's a really great resource if you're here in Georgia and you want to understand exactly what the restrictions are on your particular business, on your particular industry. They have it broken down into some pretty good and easy to use categories and charts and things like that. So make sure, check that later today, and so that you can understand exactly what the requirements are for your particular business going forward. I believe they'll probably be extended, probably to around June 12th. I'm assuming, sort of taking a guess here, but given that the medically fragile and elderly shelter-in-place order is still in place for June 12th, I think we'll probably see those other restrictions around that same time. But looking at that, understand what those are. The federal guidance, the CDC, and the OSHA guidance that's out there. I mean, it's somewhat helpful. If you go to the CDC's website, you can get some information out there. It doesn't, it's not super detailed. I hope that today is, the stuff we're going to talk about, I think, is intended to sort of fill the gaps in the stuff that you're going to see if you go to the CDC's website. So we're not going to go through in depth of any of the CDC's recommendations or anything like that. You can do that on your own time. We don't waste your time with that. So we'll try to cover the things that aren't covered there. But that's, of course, a great resource. They have some information there. We recommend that you check that out. And then, of course, there's the limited guidance that we have from OSHA specific to the virus. There's the link there. And we're going to get into that. Emily specifically is going to get into that a little bit later. But there's that link now for you to look at, whenever you have a little bit of time. Now, the logistics of reopening. This is kind of we don't want to bury the lead. We're going to hit this right out of the gate here. So this is some of the really key stuff, some of the difficult stuff, that we're trying to work through. So the first question, and this goes to what Emily was saying in the beginning about having your plan. I put the issue here of when to reopen first. That's not necessarily the order in which you're going to address this. So what some clients are doing is they're building everything else out first. They're saying, okay, here are the details of our plan for bringing employees back. But we don't know yet exactly when that's going to be, but here's what it's going to look like when we do implement it. And so that's really going to be a decision, on a sort of a case-by-case basis. And I'll highlight a couple of issues about when to reopen. I don't know ultimately how big of a deal this is going to be, and it's not a legal issue certainly. But I've read a couple of articles in Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a couple of other places about sort of these. I don't know if it's sort of political, but sort of these perception issues of businesses that are reopening right away. Apparently some people in the community have said, well, I don't really want to patronize, or a purchase from a business that, opens too soon and exposes their employees and the community to a greater risk of spreading the virus, or, something like that. Just generally putting their employees at risk. I'm not going to patronize that business going forward, because I disagree with the manner in which they reopen. I don't, this is just my opinion, but I think people will forget about that pretty quickly, about who opened when. And maybe not, maybe I'm wrong, but that's one factor to consider, and it's certainly something that our clients are considering. They're talking about, well, what's the press going to look like if we're the first, company of this size? If we're the first ones to open up and start bringing folks back, what's the backlash going to be? And I think a lot of that, to think about with that is, how visible is your business? Are you, employer in your area? Do you employ a lot of people? Is the press going to pick up on it, or are you just sort of a small business with a limited number of employees that's, that the press is not really going to jump all over? Just something to consider. Again, it's not a legal issue, but just something that our clients are talking about and definitely thinking about as they're developing their plans. And the other piece is, who are your customers? Do you cater to a specific, maybe an age demographic or something like that? And that's just, again, that's going to depend on, maybe your location. If you're a coffee shop that's located right across the street from, like a senior care center or something like that, well, that's certainly a consideration for you. Something to think about. And so that's another issue that folks are taking into consideration. They're also thinking about, depending on the nature of your business, if you have a business where, you do have an actual storefront where you have employees customers, coming in and out, how are you going to manage that? Are you going to only allow, of course, complying with any applicable government restrictions? Beyond that, are you going to also, restrict further the number of people that come in? Are you only going to, maybe, allow, certain, are you going to require people to have their temperature checked when they're coming in? The customers, things like that. Those are all things that folks are thinking about. And another issue, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but another issue clients have asked about is, should we require customers or vendors, who are bringing supplies into our business, should we require them to sign waivers? And that's another common question that we're getting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later and what we think about that generally. But then, another thing to think about is, do we need to open all of our locations at once? If you're a business that has multiple locations, do all of them need to open at once? And the approach that a lot of folks seem to be taking is that they, as part of their plan, they're doing sort of a staged reopening of their locations. One thing that a lot of folks are concerned about, and you may have read this sort of term in articles or somewhere else, but one concern folks are having is if there is a W-shaped recovery or a W-shaped reopening. A lot of companies are nervous about that. What they don't want to do is sort of open up and bring everybody back all at one time, and then there's a second wave, and we have a second, set of very restrictive limitations imposed, where we basically have to shut everything down again, and then we're right back where we started, and then we have to ramp back up again. A lot of companies, they don't want to go through that sort of W-shaped reopening, and so what a lot of companies with multiple locations are talking about is maybe doing a staged reopening, where they're just open one or two at first, seeing how it goes, and that's it's a pretty good idea if you've got multiple locations and you have the option to do that. If you've got the cash flow and everything else works, you can do it. It certainly gives you sort of a way to do a trial run, and that's the way a lot of clients are looking at it. Is, well, this is just a way to sort of test out our plan, our reopening plan, and seeing letting them sort of work out the kinks on a smaller level before they roll it out company-wide. So that's another thing to think about. Again, related to that is all parts of the business reopening. You've got your front office folks, you've got your back office folks. Maybe your front office folks aren't able to telework, or maybe your front office folks really have to be there, whether it's to greet customers or assist customers. If you've got somebody, you have cashiers, something like that for your business. Maybe you have to have your front office folks there, but maybe you don't have to have your HR department report back in, or your finance department. Maybe they can continue to telework. So that's another pretty popular option that a lot of companies are exploring is, okay, so we let our back office folks who are able to telework, we continue to have them work from home. We bring back our front office folks, or sort of what we can think of as sort of essential versus non-essential. We bring them back, and we try that first. And then as we see how the virus, infections and all that stuff, how everything's playing out, see how well how safe we feel, what the government restrictions are, then we start easing back folks back into the back office as well. So, I've hit on, I think talking through this, I've hit on most of the options that we've talked about. Staggering folks. One option that I've heard, and this seems to be a pretty popular one, is a sort of assigned or numbered shifts. So, and it can not just shifts, it can also be assigned days in the office. So one popular program is for folks, basically you take your workforce, let's say if you're going to try to bring, if your eventual goal is to have everybody come back, some clients are looking at basically taking their workforce, dividing it in half or something like that. It doesn't have to be exactly half, but divide your workforce up, and everybody is essentially assigned a day. And so if you've got half your workforce on day A, half your workforce on schedule A, and then half your workforce on schedule B. And then all the people who are assigned to group A, they come on Monday and Wednesday. And everybody who's assigned to group B, they come on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the sort of benefit of this is, obviously, you've only got, if you've divided that in half, and you've only got half your workforce in the building at one time, which allows you to, implement a lot of the health and safety measures that Emily's going to talk about in just a minute. But it also, there's just fewer people there. So obviously, there's you've cut your, I guess, sort of exposure in half by having half the people not there. And the other piece, of course, is you've got, if you truly sort of adhere to that, those two groups are never going to come into contact. And so that, again, is just another safety measure of that's, it's a whole, it's a pretty big, depending on the size of your company, that's a pretty big group of people that they're not ever going to interact with, or at least, for a while, for the foreseeable future. And then in between those days, of course you have, and again, Emily will talk about this, but you have, thorough cleaning and all that stuff done in between the days. And so that's another way of doing it. You can really kind of get creative here. There are really no, particular rules or anything like that around this. I mean, it's really, one of the benefits of this is it is sort of letting us all be a little bit creative and come with some creative solutions to really some new problems. So Emily's going to really get into detail about logistics of cleaning and disinfecting and stuff like that. But when you're thinking about how you're bringing folks back, I mean, that's absolutely going to be a huge part of your plan, because you're going to have to think about, okay, how's this really going to work? We've got folks in the office, and we want to, let's say if we want people washing their hands, every 3 times an hour or something like that, which I've heard some clients using. If we're having employees do that, okay, can our bathrooms accommodate that many people going to the bathroom all day? Do we have the facilities for that? There's a lot of kind of issues that come up around that. But certainly something to think about when Emily starts to walk through those specific guidelines around that. The other piece, we're going to shift to modified workspaces and teleworking options that Emily's going to talk about. But before we get to that, I just want to roll out or just discuss one other piece, and that's a communication plan. So one thing that we found that's really important, and a lot of you probably already know this, but part of your reopening plan, a key part of it should be your communications plan, and specifically your communications with your employees. So we found that transparency, especially in a really difficult time like this, is going to build trust and empathy with employees. And, we're always thinking about, of course, we care genuinely about the well-being of employees, but as employment lawyers, we're also always thinking about ways to mitigate risk of lawsuits. And just generally, this is not really specific to the context of the virus, but it's our experience in litigating, all types of employment claims, is that generally unhappy, disgruntled employees are the most likely ones to file lawsuits. So we generally recommend, sort of as a best practice, that anything you can do, to keep morale high and to keep employees engaged and feeling like they can trust what the company, what the employer is telling them, the better. Of course, there are going to be limits to that, and we know that. But to the extent you're able to be transparent and communicate exactly what your plans are, we believe that kind of goodwill is exactly the sort of thing that can help reduce claims in the future, especially with things related to the virus. So go ahead, and I'll turn it over to Emily to talk a little bit about modified workspaces and telework.
Yeah, so modified workspaces, that's another area where I think we're really starting to see people use their creativity a little bit to take, especially the open concept office floor plans have been so popular recently, but not only just in your typical office environment, certain other work areas, retail spaces, and things, trying to set them up so that you can have people stay socially distant, and so that you can sort of limit the amount of touch points and the amount of crossing paths between people, which can only help reduce your risk and reduce the risk of infection. So you've probably heard of or thought of some of the basic things, leaving every workstation open, every other station open, or putting up a physical barrier, plexiglass barrier. But we've also seen employers think about some other kind of creative ways to keep the flow moving, taking handles off doors so that people don't have to touch them as often, or even leaving them propped open, obviously consistent with code and fire safety and other things. But just that's one way to keep people from touching the same thing, which can only help.
Yeah, we do not, I'll just point out, we do not advise taking the handles off and leaving the employees in the building.
Don't lock anyone in. That's never a good idea. We've also seen employers who don't have have the ability to leave, for example, every workstation open, take a big conference room and use that as a way to set up some socially distant workspaces. That might be a good alternative too, to simply blocking it off. When you don't want to encourage big groups to meet, why not use that as a way to spread some folks out? And other options for kind of trying to allow people to stay apart and stay separate may not be physical barriers at all, but they may be policies that you implement or that you encourage. Maybe you draft a traffic flow plan to make sure that everyone's kind of going the same direction around the hall to limit people from crossing paths too much. Maybe you have a policy that limits the number of people in the break room at a certain time if you can't close it all together. Evan mentioned staggering shifts or alternating shifts, having people come in on different days. That can be another good option, especially if your workplace doesn't necessarily allow for you to spread people out or to limit contact. We've also seen employers, even once they are thinking about reopening, to continue encouraging video conferencing, having phone calls, and doing meetings in a distant way if they can. Even when folks are back together. And also encouraging employees to use their own devices. So it's especially true in a kind of a hot desk setup where multiple people might use the same phone, but even in terms of taking notes and passing documents back and forth, can that be done on your computer? Can that be done on the screen? So really just sort of thinking creatively, where are the touch points? Where are people crossing paths? And are there things we can do in the workplace to either set us up physically for success, or to communicate expectations through a policy of employees on what their behavior is going to be. And then another issue that we wanted to address here, more than certainly we can cover in one sitting, but important nonetheless, is telework. And it's important to reference here because telework is becoming a much more prevalent part of what people do at work, and it may for many employers be becoming more permanent, or at least more permanent than all of us might have thought back in March, or even back in April when all of this was going And it's especially true as you start bringing people back in waves, or if you do have people on a staggered shift or a rotating kind of arrangement where you're keeping some people home, bringing some people back. And it's important to think about how you're going to make those decisions, if you're going to bring a certain group back or not. You know, Evan had mentioned the idea of, do we need a certain department here? Do we need, you know, what are ways that we can determine who really needs to come in and who doesn't? But as you're making those decisions, you'll want to make sure, of course, that you are not selecting somebody either to come back to the office or to continue teleworking on any basis of their membership in a particular protected class. You know, everyone knows, but it's always a good reminder to make sure that you're not inadvertently having a disparate impact on a particular group, and that you've got your legitimate reason for who you brought back and why and when, and that can be something that you may want to include in your plan as you're thinking these issues through. Evan will talk a little bit later about accommodation issues under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it's definitely going to change things a little bit when you've got folks who have, you know, a couple month track record of working well at home, who may request to continue working from home. Those are going to be some issues both for people who maybe previously have made requests to telework as an accommodation, and for people who bring them moving forward. And something that is important to remember too is that sometimes providing equipment can be an accommodation as well. So as more folks maybe transition to a more permanent teleworking arrangement, or at least in the short term, definitely some things to think about. Lots of other things to consider when you've got folks teleworking. How are you going to keep your information secure, your data secure? Are you in a state that requires reimbursement of business expenses, and can internet or a laptop or something of that nature be covered in those? Lots of issues like that. Will you allow your employees to telework when they're sick? Have folks been doing that so far? You know, how does that interact with some of the new federal leave laws? So all issues to consider. And certainly if you don't already have a telework policy in place, or even a telework during pandemic policy in place, just some things you'll want to think through, especially if you're going to have more of your employees working remotely for longer term.
Yeah, those are all really important points. And with those in mind, we'll go ahead and sort of jump forward here to some of the specific legal issues. And again, I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on a lot of this stuff. I mean, you know, the Department of Labor has issued some regulations that are fairly comprehensive and pretty straightforward. I mean, the new laws, the good news for folks on this video is that the new leave laws aren't super complicated. I mean, they're relatively straightforward. Well, calculating the pay in some of the situations can be kind of complicated, but as far as figuring out, you know, who gets it and how much leave they get, that part's relatively straightforward. So just so you know, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So one kind of key issue, you know, under the FFCRA, which provides for the emergency paid leave and the emergency FMLA leave. Under either one of these laws, if an employee, and I just want to make sure this point's really clear, because this is important, work has to be available for employees to be eligible for either of these types of leave. So the question that we were getting, you know, right when these laws were first passed, the question was, well, you know, our business shut down before these laws were enacted, and we'd already furloughed, you know, most of our employees. So can these employees who have been furloughed, are they now eligible to essentially come and request this leave, and are we required to give them paid leave under either one of these laws at this point? And the answer is no. So the caveat to these requirements, or these eligibility requirements here, is that there has to be work available. And so if there's not work available to an employee, then they're not eligible for this leave. That's sort of the first point I want to make about these. So with these, again, I just don't want to get too bogged down in these, but these are the basics of exactly how much leave the employees get. If you have specific questions about these, please let us know. But we do anticipate that once the companies recall employees back from furloughs, or companies that have been operating the whole time and maybe you just haven't had that many requests, we do see that more employees, we anticipate more employees are going to be availing themselves of these laws. I think, again, apparently I read a lot of articles, but I read an article somewhere recently referencing that a lot of employees didn't really know about the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the FFCRA. A lot of employees apparently aren't aware that these two types of leave are available. And I think as people become more aware, people are going to start making more requests. And my prediction is, especially for the emergency FMLA leave, where we have, because that's really for folks that need that leave to care for children who are out of schools that have been shut down due to the virus. And I think as more and more parents become aware that, I can request, up to 10 weeks of partially paid leave if my school's child is closed and I have to care for them, I think we're going to see a lot more of those requests. So make sure that you're aware of those are going to be coming down the pipeline most likely, and you're ready to handle those. The wage and hour issues, I think that the two big ones that we've addressed over and over again, the first one is if you've got exempt employees, folks who are paid a salary, typically you're not allowed to sort of move their salary and hours up and down, and because that can jeopardize their exempt status for the Fair Labor Standards Act. So the case law and the regulations and the opinion letters from the Department of Labor are really pretty consistent, that if you only do it a couple or maybe a few times a year in response to sort of changing business conditions, which I think our current environment certainly qualifies for, if you only do it a couple or a few times a year, you're not going to jeopardize the exempt status for those employees. But if you do it more than that, then you really do run a risk of jeopardizing that status, and everything that comes with that. So be careful. There's a case, right? There's a couple of cases out of Texas that go in a different direction, but it's a really sort of a minority opinion, and we believe that most courts are saying it's okay to do it just a little bit, just a couple of times a year. And just so everybody's clear, what I'm talking about is if you've got, if you had sort of, let's say you have your back office employees, you say, hey, look, we're not going to furlough you, but we're going to reduce your hours from, we're going to say you only have to work 30 hours this week, and we're going to reduce your salary by, say 20%, 20 or 25%. Some folks have been concerned that would jeopardize the exempt status, and most likely it would not, as long as you're not doing it over and over again and repeated over a long period of time. The other big issue is, we suddenly saw, huge chunk of the American workforce suddenly begin working from home, and that includes a lot of non-exempt hourly positions that had never worked from home before. And frankly, a lot of companies, a lot of folks were not prepared or didn't have good systems in place for time tracking for these folks. And so that's one area that I'm particularly worried about going forward is sort of a rash of new litigation over unpaid overtime for non-exempt hourly folks who went home and started working during the pandemic, and they're going to claim that they were working way more hours, working a lot of overtime that wasn't compensated. I'm afraid that a lot of folks didn't roll out a good policy or have good practices in place to either track the time and or ensure that employees were not doing work outside of the workday. For example, if you got hourly folks checking emails at all hours of the day, and that's arguably probably compensable time. And I think there some folks may not have put good brackets around that. So the other issue, unemployment compensation, I've never, we just don't really deal with unemployment compensation that much. And I'll tell you what, I feel like we are experts on unemployment compensation now. It's never really come up. Boy, it has been a hot issue recently. So I'll just say, Georgia employers are required to file claims for their employees who are still attached to the employer. So, for example, if you have an employee that you furloughed, and let's say you send them home, but you keep them on the payroll, they're just not working any hours, you're not paying them, but maybe they're still, receiving their benefits or something like that, the employer actually has to go and file what's called a partial claim in Georgia. Now, all the states are different. You have to look really on a state-by-state basis. I know, like, for example, in Virginia, there's something similar. I think what it's called in Virginia, but there's something similar requirement in a lot of other states. But then the question that's come up is, okay, well, so we sent folks out where they were initially furloughed and we filed a partial claim. And so now we're actually, it's going to be a permanent layoff and they're separating. What do we do in that situation? The answer is the employees will need to file on their own just a regular claim for unemployment. That's how it works. Another issue that we've got some calls about is, if we have employees, so some employers are now, they're putting their plans together. And one thing they've realized is that maybe for some of their employees, when you take into consideration the stimulus check that they receive with their unemployment benefits, they're actually making more money now than they were before they went out, before they were furloughed. And so some employers are concerned that their employees are going to be reluctant to come back. And they've asked us, what do we do in that situation? Employees says, I'd rather stay home. Well, the answer is you can terminate their employment. There's really, that's sort of the general answer. Maybe other considerations that you need to think about. But generally, there's not a requirement, that we keep them on the payroll. If we have work ready and available for them, there's not really, a requirement that we, bring them back if they refuse, or keep them on the payroll if they refuse to come back. The last issue, obviously, that is a big one. I hope folks have probably looked at this, is the WARN Act. A couple of issues that we've dealt with under the WARN Act, and this, of course, is the law that requires us to give 60 days notice when we terminate groups of employees. It's generally, if you're talking about groups of 50 or more employees, or 33% of the employees at a particular job site or location, you have to give them 60 days notice if you're going to hit those employee thresholds within a 90-day period. And so that's been a big issue. It's hard to count, and that really requires a lot of planning and math, frankly, to figure out whether you need to give those notices or not. And one issue that's come up is whether temporary layoffs that were initially temporary that become permanent, whether that triggers obligations under the WARN Act. And then the other is, if you reduce, and a lot of people don't know this, but if you reduce employees' hours under 50%, let's say they're still working 25% of their time, or even 10%, 5%, let's say they're just checking emails from home, something like that. That if their hours drop below 50%, generally that counts as an employment loss for WARN purposes. So they count as sort of an employee that's been laid off under the WARN Act, and that has surprised some folks. So those are just some legal issues that we've been dealing with, and some things to keep in mind before I hand it back off to Emily to talk about more health and safety.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, so health and safety is obviously a huge category, and there's lots of suggested guidance out there. There's lots of sort of tips, but there's oftentimes more questions than answers. But we'll try and hit on some of the issues that you see here as quickly as we can, just to give you an idea of kind of the high points to be thinking about and considering as you're putting together your plan to bring folks back. And so the first thing that most people think about, I think, when they're thinking about workplace safety is OSHA. OSHA is the federal agency that maintains and the safety. As Evan mentioned earlier, as of right now, OSHA has not issued a specific standard relating just to COVID-19. There is a guidance document that they issued back in March, a 35-page document with lots of suggestions, but it's not binding as of now. It's got suggestions for employers of all sizes, but it also takes workplaces and categorizes them based on the OSHA's perceived level of risk of exposure, and has additional steps for workplaces that it has defined as a higher risk of an exposure. But there are general suggestions in there that can be worth a look. I think we've got the link on one of the slides in here. If you want to take a look at that on your own time, we won't make you run through it. For example, preparing a written infectious disease preparedness and response plan, and coming up with administrative controls, kind of like we talked about earlier, to keep employees from interacting too much, and extending your risk for infection. OSHA also put out this handy little 10-step chart that you'll see here, some recommended tips to prevent infection, which I believe has now been translated into something like 11 languages. So certainly something that could be an easy reference guide to maybe pass along to your employees as well. Something that folks ought to keep in mind is that just because OSHA has not created a specific standard as to COVID-19 doesn't mean that other OSHA standards can't apply. Just a few examples. You may have heard the term PPE being flown around and in the headlines, personal protective equipment. OSHA certainly has standards and regulations that apply to various sorts of PPE. There's a whole respirator program, for example, covering the proper fitting and use of the N95 masks that you've heard so much about. The bloodborne pathogen standard can be implicated for employees who are going to be working near human bodily fluids as part of their job, which may or may not cover many workplaces outside of the healthcare industry. And OSHA has what's called a hazard communication standard as well, which governs employee exposure to chemicals. And a lot of employers, I think, may not be familiar with these types of standards because it may not be something that they are encountering maybe in an office environment on a day-to-day basis. But some of these standards, for example, the hazard communication standard, can apply when you're dealing with certain cleaning chemicals and even common cleaning chemicals that might be used or recommended by the CDC to clean or disinfect a workspace and as a result of a suspected COVID-19 infection being present. And so sometimes these standards that might not have been applicable before can come into effect now. And of course, if even in the absence of any other OSHA specific standard, the general duty clause allows OSHA to go in and cite employers in kind of the unusual situation maybe where they are not providing a safe work environment, safe from recognized hazards for their employees. That may or may not be, we don't have a ton of guidance yet on how OSHA will necessarily enforce that. Certainly, in the presence of a known infection and not allowing protective equipment and things like that could be creating a workplace that would be considered unsafe, sufficient to warrant a citation, but it may be a bit of a gray area when there's no known infection. So it's just something to keep in mind. None of the OSHA guidance that we have now related to COVID-19, as I mentioned, is necessarily binding, but following OSHA guidance, and OSHA tends to cite a lot to the CDC guidance that we have referenced as well as far as cleaning and sanitation and other related suggestions. It's not necessarily enough to provide immunity from a citation or to totally prohibit OSHA from coming in and saying what you're doing isn't safe. But OSHA has indicated that it will take a good faith effort to ensure safety into account when it's thinking about whether to issue a citation or what severity the citation might be. So following those types of guidelines can be really good evidence that you're doing your due diligence as an employer to keep your workplace safe. And certainly something that you would want to document in your plan. It's also possible that if there were a future tort suit, maybe a premises liability suit, that recommendations for cleaning or sanitation or even for social distancing could sort of become the cited standard of care. So there's certainly things you'll want to pay attention to and consider. As Evan mentioned, we're not going to go into the full detail of everything the CDC has recommended. We're sure you're more than familiar and more than we could cover quickly, but it's definitely worth a look. We've highlighted the link here. There's guidance specific to lots of different kinds of workplaces, indoor, outdoor. There's specific guidance to cleaning and disinfecting workplaces that have been closed for a little while. Maybe if you've been shut down due to a stay-at-home order, for example, and even to specific surfaces like fabric or porous surfaces as opposed to a hard surface. And in addition, there is specific guidance as to cleaning and disinfecting an area where someone confirmed or suspected to have COVID-19 comes into the workplace. And the big takeaway there is that the CDC has recommended the use of products that are EPA approved for use against the virus that causes COVID-19. So encourage you to check those out. Certainly with, we skipped ahead here. Certainly another area where employers have been asking, clients have been asking us lots of questions relates to testing and what can they do in terms of testing employees or vendors who come to their work site. We would recommend, if you can, to use a third-party testing provider, but the most important thing is to make sure that any test you use is accurate, you get accurate results. You know how to use them, you know how to read them. And we also recommend that you consider whether testing is necessary or suitable for your particular work environment and what kind of testing might help you the most. Just certainly something to approach deliberately. Typically, employers are aware that asking for medical information or testing for medical conditions in their employees is not allowed under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but the EEOC has issued guidance allowing certain types of inquiries in certain circumstances in the face of the pandemic. Asking about symptoms that have been recognized by the CDC, for example, measuring temperatures, and even giving virus tests in some circumstances. The most important thing to remember with these tests is that they need to be, in addition to accurate, applied in a uniform and non-discriminatory manner. And any test results, any medical information must be maintained as confidential medical information as required by the ADA, which means it needs to be limited on a need-to-know basis within your company and kept separately from the employee's personnel file. And something we've also had clients starting to think through is the logistics of what testing might entail. If you're going to do temperature screens, for instance, are you testing just your employees, or will you include vendors, business invitees, clients, and others? Will you have them do it at the same time? If you have a 9 a.m. shift, for example, with everybody who has to come in getting screened first, do you have space for employees to wait in a socially distant manner, 6 feet apart? Can you do it inside if it rains? Do you have that kind of room? And how much time is that going to add to their workday? Certainly, the issues of compensability are complex, but a long wait time to be tested and screened temperature-wise before entering the workplace could create a claim on an employee's behalf that they should be compensated for that time. So definitely things to think about. And then I think finally, the issue that we've had a lot of employers ask us about is, what do I do if I have an employee who tests positive, or who I suspect has tested positive, or who I suspect is infected for COVID-19? And our best recommendation there is that you'll want to make sure you have a policy, first of all, requiring employees not to report to work if they have any symptoms of COVID-19. You'll also want to have a policy that allows you to quickly identify and isolate anybody who does come into the workplace and begins exhibiting those types of symptoms. The OSHA guidance that I mentioned earlier has some suggestions for having an isolation space where you can keep somebody who you think might be infected separate from the rest of the workforce until you can send them home or to medical care. If you do find out that somebody has tested positive as well, you will like to have a policy to address how to handle employees who are in close contact with that person. You can ask that employee who they may have come in direct contact with over a certain day period, the last 14 days, for example. And you can use your common sense as well, who you think they might have encountered, so that you can let others know that they may have been in contact with somebody who's tested positive. You'll want to keep the identity of the person who tested positive confidential to the extent that you can. You want to keep that person anonymous, but certainly informing others that they may want to get a test. And be sure that you then follow the CDC guidance to clean and disinfect the workspace of any employee who you suspect has tested positive or who you know has tested positive, so that you can keep it sanitized.
All right, I see we're really at the top of our time here. We're at 2 o'clock, and I don't know if folks are going to have questions. We'll stay on as long as you want. I mean, I think we've really kind of gone through all the claims here that we anticipate. I think we've really kind of talked through most of this stuff. The one I'll mention really quick is one concern we've heard over and over again is whether or not, we have, or whether we anticipate claims against employers by employees for workplace injuries, specifically contracting the virus. We see that as a compensable. I mean, to the extent that the employee can show that they contracted it in the workplace, which I think is going to be a hard issue to prove. We believe that that's really going to be a workers' compensation issue. There's a workers' compensation bar in Georgia that requires, workplace injuries. They're only compensable through the workers' compensation program. And so we don't see that as being, a big source of liability. I mean, maybe for workers' comp carriers, insurers, maybe something that they're thinking more closely about. But as far as actual employers, we don't have a big concern about, tort lawsuits or something like that against companies for employees who've allegedly contracted the virus in the workplace. The other stuff here, again, you just kind of think through. I mean, the things that we've talked about, failures to accommodate. You still got to engage in an interactive process with employees if they're making some type of request for an accommodation, whether it's to work from home or have a modified workspace based on maybe a medical condition they have related in some way to the virus. I think everything else is really talked about. And I think just generally the last sort of closing thought I'll throw out there is I think the general consensus among employment lawyers is that we do anticipate at least some level of uptick in claims. And that's, if you look back at the Great Recession back in between 2008, 2011, we saw a pretty big uptick in claims during that period of time, but simply as a result of, people are laid off or fired, and they resort to an employment lawsuit. And so we do just see sort of a general uptick in not just virus-related issues, but also, age discrimination claims and race discrimination claims, things like that. We do anticipate seeing more of those claims. So in this time, always, of course, sort of adhere to your best practices, your best HR practices, and, hiring and firing and bringing folks back from furloughs and all that stuff. Just make sure you're mindful of those issues that we normally would talk about in non-pandemic times. So that's what we've got for y'all. And so, if you want to stick around, we'll answer a question and have gotten nowhere to be. I'm happy to hang around for a little while and answer questions. You can email us directly or call us as your contact information. But yeah, Mary Claire, do we have any questions that came through?
Yeah, so we actually were told we disabled the chat feature for security purposes since a lot of the Zooms were being hacked. But
that's good.
Yeah, so just for security reasons. But yes, if people would like to, if y'all have my email address as well. So if y'all have anything, please email me and I can get that to y'all. And then y'all have y'all's up as well. So any questions or anything like that, we'll make sure to filter those through as well. Thank y'all again. That was very informative. And I'll pass it over to you, Jack.
Yeah, Emily and Evan, thank you so much. During this time, we all have a lot of priorities and a lot of things going on. So for y'all to take this time out and do this for us, we really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Of course.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, nice to meet two more great people from Troutman. And for all those on the call still, if you will, there's a survey that the membership received. If y'all can take time to fill that out and send that in, that would help. We really appreciate that. With that, any questions that you have regarding the subject matter today, you see Evan and Emily's email down there, but also like Mary Claire was saying, if you want to send them to her, we can filter that and get answers to all those and get that back out to everybody on the call. So thank you everybody for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks a lot. See y'all later.